Looking for a first-hand account of how the Seahawks rookies looked at mandatory rookie minicamp, both the drafted and undrafted guys? Well, look no further. Today, a first-person report from Corbin Smith of All Seahawks and Locked On Seahawks. He was there. He'll share his insights with us next on Seahawks Forever.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
Before we get to Corbin, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the bell so you always get notification of future episodes. If you prefer audio podcasts, you can subscribe on any audio platform. But if you want to hear ad-free episodes, you can do so only on Spotify for a small monthly fee. That link will be in the description. Also, if you subscribe to YouTube Premium, you can watch the video episodes without ads anywhere, actually, any show on YouTube. So consider checking that out. And if you just want to support the show, you can hit that super thanks or buy me a coffee or a beer, as many of you have over the last couple of weeks and months. I always appreciate the support, and always that, I say this from time to time, but it can never be said enough. I know how much good Seahawks content there is out there, and I appreciate you making me part of the rotation and involving me in that. Here now, my conversation with Corbin Smith. Always good to have Corbin Smith on the show. And for the first time, what's going to be different about this conversation is we're going to talk about your experiences watching rookie minicamp under a different head coach than you've ever covered in Seattle before. What stood out to you the most? I know there was a lot of talk about music levels and things like that, but just as far as sort of some of the X's and O's or the nuts and bolts of logistically how practices are run, and even maybe a feel or a tone that you felt like stood out this year, something that was different.
It definitely was more business-like, Dan. That would be the first thing that I would say. And that's not taking a shot at Pete Carroll at all. We know what his style of practice was, and it was very successful. But you can just tell that it's not, we're not going to fly through bag drills and everybody's going to be playing the hype train. They didn't do any of that kind of stuff. It was, let's get out here, let's get right to work, let's get into our individuals. And the music, I know everybody's been talking about it, but Dan, this is what it sounded like out there. It sounded like they had a 1985 boombox sitting inside of a porta pot. That is what it sounded like out there. You could barely hear it. It was just totally different. There's not going to be any Techno Thursdays or things like that with this coaching staff, but I thought it was kind of a breath of fresh air, just seeing how they got down to work. They were ready to roll. We're all business. And I think a lot of these draft picks Seattle brought in, they fit that mentality. When you go back and you look at what they did in college and what their coaches have said about them, that these guys check that box off. And so I think that was a bigger priority. And that's maybe where Mike Macdonald's presence in the draft room is going to play out the most.
Obviously, I want to spend a lot of time talking about your observations and what you saw from some of the rookies at the mini camp, but that tone and that style difference. We've heard about that. We even, I think it was Charles Cross who described Macdonald as very blunt in how he approaches his players and just kind of gets down to giving you your feedback in a different way and coaching you up in a different way than Pete Carroll did. And, I talked to somebody in the organization over the weekend that said that so far the players have responded to that's been a little bit of a positive change and a breath of fresh air, that it was time for the message to change. However, Pete was known as such a player's coach. Guys wanted to play here. Players that we jettisoned, would go see how things are run in other organizations and want to come back because it was such a positive atmosphere. How do you think that changed once we get down to it and training camp opens and these guys start doing this full time again? What kind of transition do you think that's going to be for the veteran players to adapt to that new style?
I think that the first key, as with any coach, you got to win games. And if you don't, then it doesn't matter what your coaching style is. It's a lot harder to keep guys buying in. But I will say this, having been around the team a little bit and being around Mike Macdonald, yes, he's a lot more blunt, a lot more stern than what Pete Carroll ever was. But at the same time, this is not Bill Belichick either. This guy is not going to be sitting around with a Grinch face 24/7. He laughs out there and he's smiling plenty. He gives the guy, he has his own way. I mean, he is not going to be the same sense of humor that Pete Carroll was, but this guy is going to be able to relate with his players. You can see it on the field, and you can just see the way that he carries himself, even with the media, the way that he carries himself. He is not, again, he's not, the evil empire. This is not a guy that's going to be mistaken as Palpatine, but he is a guy that when you look at the way that he handles things, he is more serious. He's more of a business-like tone, but I don't think that this is suddenly going to cross over to where the guys are not having fun either. They looked like they were still having a pretty good time out there during rookie minicamp.
One thing that struck me too is how transparent and open Coach Macdonald was about his learning process and his adjustment to having to run practice for the first time, and even admitting that the first workout that he had adding dirty, calling the plays on defense because he, in his own words, said just trying to figure out how to run a practice. That was interesting to listen to. And I also heard very similar things from Dave Canales recently in an interview he was doing about just learning how logistically different it is to run a practice. But and some people took that and ran with it. Like, how are you not prepared for that? But if you were just an objective observer showing up to practice that first workout and you didn't know it was a new coaching staff, would you have picked up on that difference, or did it just seem like kind of a well-oiled machine and any other workout like you've seen in the NFL?
I have seen disjointed practices at the high school, college, and NFL level, Dan. That was not what I saw the Friday that I was there at rookie minicamp. And there's obviously some things they're going to tweak. And I think Mike Macdonald, he's got to figure out, remember, he's never been a head coach at any level. So right. This is all, even if he's been involved in NFL practices, it's a totally different thing when you've got to put on the head coaching cap, the administrative stuff that goes with that. So he's going to be working, and he's got a lot of guys in this staff he has never coached with before. A lot of times when you see first-time head coaches take over in the NFL, they hire a bunch of guys that they've worked with previously. Mike Macdonald did not do that. Whether that works out or not, we'll see. But he wanted to get the best coaches he could get. And so he's going to be meshing what those coaches want to do, how they want to handle practice with what his vision is. And I think they're going to be able to, once they get into OTAs, they're going to start figuring out, hey, this is the way that we're going to run this. So it looked pretty well orchestrated to me out there. You didn't see wasted time. You didn't see issues transitioning between individuals to team periods. It looked pretty fluid. Is it going to be perfect? Heck no. It's rookie minicamp. You got a bunch of tryout players out there that aren't going to be here in 48 hours. But still, I thought that you could see that it was a pretty well orchestrated practice plan, and they're going to be able to really ratchet that process up here in coming weeks. So if he was somebody that was really completely out of his element, you would have been able to see that at least for a few practices. I did not see that on Friday when I was there.
Let's talk about some of the guys in helmets. One of the things I used to enjoy the most when I was covering high school and college football is when I would show up to watch a practice or even pregame warmups of a team I hadn't seen in person before, always trying to spot and just figure out for myself who the starters were. Especially, it was always fun at the quarterback position. Just watching, I remember the first time ever seeing Drew Bledsoe as a true freshman working out. It was like you instantly knew which guy was Drew Bledsoe, just because he moved differently, acted differently, threw the ball differently. It was a different thing. Is that kind of, because on tape from the little bit we got to see in highlights of drills and things, he certainly stood out. Is that kind of how Byron Murphy looked to you in that first workout, that he just stood out as a guy that was different?
I remember when I was in high school, you'd always be looking for the guy, the player that was intimidating getting off the bus. Byron Murphy II is that player. Now, when you think about the fact, usually somebody that would fit that description is the really tall and powerful player. So this is not a super tall defensive tackle at 6'1", but yet he very much looks like the guy, oh, who is this guy when he gets off the bus? And a lot of it has to do, he clearly does not miss leg day. This guy, even for a defensive lineman, his calves are as big as his thighs. And the way that he moves with those huge legs, and I've been saying this for the last few days, and this is just the nerd coming out of me being a huge Lord of the Rings fan. He reminds me, his legs are like the Ents. And you see him sprinting, trying to take down the fortress. That's what this guy looks like. He's got these tree stumps for legs, and yet you watch him doing the drills, and he moves like a linebacker. And so he, at least in the non-padded practices, you can see why this guy would be a first-round pick, a consensus first-round pick, just with the movement skills, the way he was hitting the dummies. There's only so much you can glean in these non-padded practices in May, but he very much lived up to the hype from the athleticism standpoint, just seeing what he looked like on the field. He looks every bit like a first-round selection.
Yeah, his formidable lower half is what stood out to me the first time I ever really started digging in and watching him. It's why I think his game is going to translate even at those dimensions, because, you do see a lot of guys that are 6'3", 6'4", 320, which on the roster might look more, might look better to you as a guy playing interior defensive line, but they're high cut, right? And they just don't have that lower half. That anchor he's able to build is really exciting. Let's talk about one of the other big dudes and the next highest draft pick, Christian Haynes. To no surprise, although it sounds like he did take some reps at left guard, they plugged him in at right guard where he's played his entire college career. How natural did he look in his first workout?
I didn't get to see him do any of the left guard reps because that was on Saturday, but this is one of those guys that you can put a blindfold on and have him go up to the line of scrimmage, and he's going to be able to get his footwork down. I mean, he has been playing at a high level for such a long time at UConn. And I've mentioned this, you can see it on the field. And this is what I look for when you're watching non-padded practice. Obviously, you're not going to see Christian Haynes getting his hands on a defender and being able to do anything in the line of scrimmage. It's prohibited. But the two things that I look for the functional athleticism. Does the testing match up with what we're seeing on the field, or does the film match up with what we're seeing on the field? Very much could see that with Christian Haynes, with how smooth he was, how fluid he was moving in space. His footwork was excellent. So you can tell this is a very technically sound player. And I really enjoyed watching him on the 3-man sled. And that's only going to tell you so much because it's not a moving target. And yet at the same time, if you're not getting the proper technique to get extension, you're not going to be moving that sled at all. And so it forces you to be technically sound. And he was clearly the best at that drill as well. Once he figured out, okay, this is the way this works, let's get locked out. And he does such a good job with his hand placement, and there's great power there in his strikes as well. So I can't wait to see him actually be able to hit somebody in the line of scrimmage. That's going to be a while till we get to see that. But the fluid athleticism, the pass protection set technique, all that stuff that you can see in these practices, it was on display. And you could tell this is a guy that's very polished coming into the league.
And I'm really intrigued by Satawa Lemea, a guy that, only played the right side in college. And so we were expecting to see some of him at left guard. Did he take some of those reps on Friday while you were there?
That's every one of his snaps at left guard from what I remember. And this really shouldn't be a surprise. Talking to his offensive line coach on our podcast last week, Jim Harding has been at Utah for 15 years, I believe. So he's coached a lot of really good players that have come into the NFL. And they were getting ready to play Florida 2 years ago, and he had been playing right guard still. And they had like 4 days until the game in Gainesville. So you're playing in the swamp. And they just decided, we're going to move you out to right tackle. And he did it without a hitch. And so you're talking about a guy that's just got a really high football IQ. He has great versatility. I don't think he's going to have any trouble. He looked like he was very comfortable at left guard, even though it's not a position he played in game action. This is a guy that has that type of versatility, and he's a pretty darn good athlete. He's not going to be posting the same testing numbers as Christian Haynes in some regards, but this is a kid that's got plenty of athleticism, and he packs a punch. So I think that this is the day 3 guy you keep an eye on. And if I'm Laken Tomlinson, I'm just saying this right now. If I'm Laken Tomlinson, I'm thinking, I know Seattle gave me $4 million, up to $4 million, but I'm looking in the rearview mirror because I think Lemea has the skill set and the experience to be able to make this interesting early.
And then, what does that do for Anthony Bradford's job security? Because the Seahawks last year on the initial 53 only kept 3 guards. And so do you think, I guess a 2-part question, do you think the plan ultimately when they get into full squad workouts is to work Lemea at left and right guard, prepare him to possibly be able to provide depth at both of those? And do you think Bradford is a misfit in what they want to do up front, that he might be on the outside looking in, trying to make this roster?
I think that is the biggest question we can't answer right now, because until we get to see where Bradford fits in on the practice field and get a better idea what type of players they are looking for. I feel like the draft picks and then what they did in free agency, you're seeing a blend of players in terms of what schemes that they're best at. And so I can't necessarily point at a series of moves and say, oh, this tells me they're going to be a very zone-centric team, or this tells me they're going to be a very gap-centric team. They've kind of muddied that up a little bit. I think that's how Ryan Grubb wants it. That's how Scott Huff wants it. They want to have guys that can do a little bit of both. So apologies. My phone, I thought I had it on silent, but the Mario Brothers is going off. My apologies. Give your listeners a little bit of a insight to what my ringtone sounds like.
Always a good time.
Yeah. Anyway, but no. So going back to the Anthony Bradford situation, I think what you're looking at is a big question mark in terms of until we see on the field, because Bradford tested pretty well at the combine 2 years ago. There is some athleticism there at 330 plus pounds. I want to see where he's at physically, because I thought he was a little bit too big last year as a rookie. I'd like to see him be a little bit leaner, and I think that he could be a really solid starting guard in the league. Is he going to be able to fend off Christian Haynes? That is really the question. I think those two are the main competitors at right guard, and I think LaMea and Tomlinson are going to be battling at left guard. And you mentioned the three guards in the roster last year. The thing about this is Nick Harris has started a game or two in the NFL at guard. Yep. Seattle could be in a position where, like, well, he's our fourth guard. He's going to be our backup center. He's our fourth guard. We're only going to keep three. And so this is a position. It's weird saying this where it was at like 3 weeks ago, but to me, this has now gone from being the clear weakness on the roster. There's still a lot of question marks, but it's turned into maybe the most compelling position to watch throughout the offseason going into training camp.
I was just going to say that. I talked about it on a live last night. I'm fascinated by how this group's going to shake out, because, you know, you look at the roster a year ago, and as you said, even a few weeks ago, and it was still, you know, how often was Schneider asked over the offseason, are you still going to add? Are you going to add? What are you doing about guard? What are you doing about guard? And now, you know, you look at the depth chart, and there's going to be some guys cut that might hurt, or that might be surprising. It's I'm already looking at, okay, how do you protect Mike Jarrell if he goes, or is it Jarrell? How's the pronunciation on that? Okay. I've said it. I've gone about 50-50 on it, hoping I'll get it right half the time. But this is a guy with all sorts of athletic upside, but comes from a smaller level of competition. And you have to wonder if, like, he might not be advanced enough to push a guy like Stone Forsythe maybe for the fourth tackle spot. Yeah. But you also might have a hard time sneaking him through to the practice squad with that kind of upside. Similar to the way the Seahawks kind of sniped Raekwon O'Neal last year and carried him on the roster all year because they thought he had some ceiling. What did you see from Jarrell, just kind of in those movement skills and how that athleticism you talked about earlier might translate?
Yeah, this is really showing the nerd in me. I was able to get some all-22 Finley film. I had a connection, was able to get that. And so maybe that doesn't surprise you, but I was able to watch one of his games, and I was really surprised. Again, it's Division II competition. You have to take it with a grain of salt, but I was really surprised with how technically sound this guy was. And watching him on the practice field on Friday, you could see that. Again, there's going to be some missteps with him. And I could see Scott Huff a few times had to pull him aside like, hey, this is how I want it. You know, this is going to be a huge jump. There's no question about it. But you cannot teach athleticism. And this guy has, I would say he is probably in the 95th, 96th percentile for offensive linemen as an athlete. He's not the greatest athlete that's ever been an offensive lineman in the NFL, but he is in that top 5%. And we're talking a guy that ran a 4.94 at 310 pounds, 32-inch vertical, basketball player formerly. So he's got that background. And this is a guy that is more polished than you expect. So if he is able to take that technique and he is able to really figure out going against NFL competition, that is going to be the key. How does he handle blocking Uchenna Nwosu at practice, for example? That is really going to be the telling factor. But I don't think Seattle drafted this kid with hopes that we can get him on the practice squad and we're just going to coast for a few years. I don't think they looked at it from that perspective. They're hoping that he can push Stone Forsythe, who is in the last year of his rookie deal, by the way. Right. If he ends up being just as good, you could make that move going with Mike Jarrell instead because, hey, we got 4 years on club control at a cheap price with him instead of Stone Forsythe. So I think this puts Stone Forsythe very much on notice.
And then I think, you know, before we switch over to defense, where there's all sorts of intriguing rookie storylines, it's the one job that we know for sure that is open is the Seahawks typically are going to carry 4 running backs, and there are only 3 veterans on the roster. And so they bring 3 undrafted guys in, George Halani, Kobe Lewis, and Tamarick Williams. Halani, the guy that they had out for a 30 visit, probably the more recognizable name. From a bunch of services I've seen, if he had not had the injury history, he might have been a draftable player. You and I chatted a little bit yesterday. You think he's the front runner for that spot if it were today?
Yeah, and I think it's a wide gap. Now, we'll see where things go through the rest of this offseason program. But Halani, he's a player you don't necessarily see this on tape all the time, but he ran a 4.52 40-yard dash at 5'11", 206. He's got a fairly similar build to Zach Charbonnet, just a little bit lighter than Charbonnet. And some of the reporters, we were talking about this, and he looked like Zach Charbonnet, except different number on the rookie minicamp. Just the way that he moves, he's got a really thick lower body, big calves, not Byron Murphy calves, but he's got huge calves. And this guy, when you watch the tape, he's had 2 of his 4 years at Boise State where he had well over 1,000 yards. 3 of his 4 years, he averaged at least 5.2 yards per carry. So he is very efficient with his opportunities. He would have had 1,000 rushing yards last year if not for an injury. The durability is what caused him to not be drafted. He's got enough physical traits. He can catch the ball, 88 career receptions, Dan. And I think that is what really gives him the edge here. He has a lot of Zach Charbonnet qualities, but he also could be a third down option. Pass protection's been inconsistent. There's some really good tape. There's some not so good tape. So if Seattle can coach him up to be more consistent in that regard, he very easily could be your DJ Dallas replacement, and he can make things interesting for Kenny McIntosh too, because quite frankly, Halani is a little more athletic, at least by testing numbers.
And then I said we were about to wrap up the offense, but one more thing, because before we started recording, we talked a little bit about tight end. We didn't get to see A.J. Barner because of a hamstring injury that he said wasn't very serious. He should be back soon. But you told me something about another tight end that wasn't drafted that you think might actually have a better all-around game.
Yeah, I think that A.J. Barner, you can understand why the Seahawks drafted him, because he's a very good run blocker, and he's coming from a pro-style offense. He's huge. He's 6'6". I mean, he just looks the part. He's a good player. But I was surprised Jack Westover didn't get drafted, to be honest with you. And I could see this being a situation where these two guys are, if they're side by side, you could maybe make the argument that Westover maybe has a better all-around game. And he went into this draft process viewed as kind of an undersized blocker, but you go back and you watch the film, a lot of Dylan Johnson's big runs last year, who had a key block, number 37. Westover just plays with a chip on his shoulder. He's physical. So this is not a knock on Barner. I think what this means is, hey, Farrell Brown, I know we gave you a one-year deal, but we got 2 rookies here that we're very excited about to have different games. And oh, by the way, Jack Westover last year caught more than 40 passes and 4 touchdowns in Ryan Grubb's offense at Washington. So this is going to be an interesting camp battle at that position, because I don't think they're going to use as many multi-tight end sets in Ryan Grubb's offense. So I don't think they're going to keep more than 3 there, but this really makes it interesting. If Barner is as good as Brown in the blocking category and Westover stands out as receiver, I don't know how you can't keep both those guys. Yeah.
And they have at times kept 4 tight ends. They I guess technically they did last year, because Brady Russell was on the roster most of the season, I think, after they picked him up off the Philadelphia practice squad, right? So,
yep.
Probably just a mix and match between how many receivers they want to catch or hang on to. But that'll be fun to watch. The one connection to the Husky offense certainly would serve him well. On defense, not a lot to talk about up front, but the Seahawks did decide to sign a kid that was just a camp invite, and he impressed enough to get signed to the 90-man roster. And I had never heard of Buda Jones out of Troy, but then I went to YouTube and tried to find, and again, you're not going to find any all 22 tape unless you have a contact for that, but I did find some highlights, and I was really surprised. This guy's power combination and how he holds up at the point of attack and just how well he moves at that size was admittedly lower level of competition, was really impressive. What stood out to you about Jones?
So watching on Friday, I was over there watching Byron Murphy II, and I kept going to this other player. I'm like, he looks like he's the same build as Byron Murphy II.
Very similar.
I had to really look at the numbers closely, and I started to think, who is this kid? And again, you don't get to see him going up against actual offensive linemen. So it's really difficult to evaluate. And yet this kid looked the part. And I went and looked at the roster and I'm like, Buda Jones, tryout player. And then I was like, Troy kicks out some pretty good players. They had a couple guys I really liked in this draft class that ended up getting picked. Vidal went to Jim Harbaugh on the Chargers. I think he's going to be an awesome fit in Jim Harbaugh's offense. But Troy kicks out some really good NFL talent. That is a good non-Power 5 program for developing pro players. So I went back and I found some film myself. And like you were saying, you're not going to see the sexy splash plays from this guy. He only had 6 tackles for loss, no sacks in his career. So you're not going to see him make the disruptive plays that Byron Murphy II makes. That's why you were an undrafted player. And at the same time, the guy is incredibly stout against double teams. He is incredibly athletic, both using power steps and trying to man up with double teams as a 2-gapper, So you can see him as a developmental nose tackle that may have the upside to be able to play on Sundays, as long as you're in the understanding this is not going to be a guy that's going to provide us much in the pass rushing game, but he's going to be able to handle all those duties as a 0 or 1 tech that you're looking for. And the only thing that really was holding him back in the draft process, he got minus 30-inch arms. I mean, he's got very sawed-off arms, which could be an issue, but his quickness and the way he throws his hands offsets it some. So that is a very crowded position group. It's going to be tough for him to make the roster. And yet I could see this being a guy who, if they can keep him on the practice squad, he could play on Sundays for this team at some point.
And then of those other day 3 guys on defense, I was absolutely floored that they ended up taking the 2 corners out of Auburn when they did. But the more I look at it, the more I like it. And now you start to see that position group kind of stack up, and there's going to be some real competition there. What'd you see from the two Auburn dudes, Pritchett and James?
You could see the speed with Pritchett. That was really the first thing that showed up in their drill work and seeing him move up and down the field. You could see the 4.3 speed. This guy can fly down the field. He is definitely tall and lean. This is a player that isn't going to look physically imposing at the quarterback position. This isn't Brandon Browner 2.0, but he is a guy that can fly up and down the field. I was more drawn to the other corner from Auburn, though, DJ James, who he just looks the part of a physical slot corner, and it's not a position he played a lot in college. And you look at the athletic testing numbers, his change of direction measurements were not overly impressive. And yet you turn on the tape at Oregon previously and then go into Auburn, and you can see that this guy has that ability to handle 2-way routes from the slot. He is a physical player against the run. He will come up and hit people. He can play press coverage. That was what he was best at on the outside. So he checks off so many of those boxes Seattle's looking for. And really the player that gets put on the most notice here is Kobe Bryant, because where do you put him now? If he's not going to be in the safety mix, you've got Devin Witherspoon. I think James is very much going to be in there for sub-package reps. I think he's got a better chance to play defensive reps right off the bat than Pritchett does just because of his skill set. But Pritchett on special teams is where I'm excited to see, because with that speed, he had really good return numbers a few years ago in Auburn. Then they had him as a full-time defensive player. They stopped using him on special teams. But he could be one of those X factors to watch that gets early snaps on kick return and ends up being a weapon there with the new rules being put in place. So there's a place maybe that both these guys could be. And I think James is actually, though, the one that may be better positioned to maybe get a few snaps on defense if things roll his way.
And then what does this do for Mike Jackson's standing on the roster? We know that they signed him to a new deal the other day. They'd given him the tender. They agreed to a lower cap number, save some room that way. But a guy that I keep thinking is going to have some appeal to Mike Macdonald, because he's probably the most physical of that corner group. Is he a guy that could project? I just feel like his athletic profile and his body type, the Seahawks have had some success in the past kind of grooming hybrid players, right? Deshaun Shedd stands out. Obviously, they're trying to do it now with Kobe Bryant. Could Jackson potentially slide into a kind of a dual role like that?
I'm not going to say it's impossible, Dan, but I think that more likely he's going to be battling against Rick Woolen for a starting job. And I know that might sound crazy, but this coaching staff has no allegiance to the returning players. And Rick Woolen has to show that he is going to be more consistent coming up and making plays against the run and playing with physicality, because if you don't do that in Mike Macdonald's defense, he's going to find somebody that will. So they were able to make this move to lower his salary. But I could still see Mike Jackson being in a position, especially if they want Devin Witherspoon playing inside a lot. Mike Jackson could still be out there with Reek Woolen because he can play on both sides. I still think that he's going to be in the mix there. But drafting these two corners, you have to remember, Dan, Jackson, Trey Brown, Artie Burns. I mean, you want to talk about a guy that's now in a really tough spot to make this football team. But all those guys are under contract only for this year. So next year they needed to add corners. So they decided why not, and they were looking at special teams as well. So I don't think this impacts necessarily Mike Jackson's path unless these two rookies come in and just outplay him. But Mike Jackson has a history of saying, wait a second, don't forget about me. So I think he's still going to be very much in the competition on the outside there and is going to be near the top of the depth chart.
And then, of course, we have to talk about Tyrice Knight. Not probably, I would say the most polarizing of the draft picks that the Seahawks made this year, that some people feel like he was a little bit of a reach and that there were other guys on the board they preferred. And you know how draft opinions go. How natural did he look his first day of practice?
Well, the athlete and the fact that he's played multiple linebacker positions at UTEP, you could see that. Now, I was not there for Saturday's practice, and from what I was told on Saturday, there were some plays where they were able to sprinkle in some misdirection, and of course, he ended up in a bad spot. He is going to have to learn to be able to combat that at linebacker if he wants to play on Sundays. That was the biggest issue watching his UTEP film too, and I think it boils down to there was a lot of plays where I don't want to say he was guessing, but there was a lot of plays where it's like, hey, this is the read I've got. I'm going to go attack this. And then other teams were using misdirection. They had candy that they were trying to lure him with, and they were successful doing that too much. But he still found his way to the football so often that he was able to offset that against lower competition. So he is a player until we see him in exhibition season. I think that he, of all the draft picks, that may be the most important player for the preseason reps to see how he is able to diagnose run plays. Is he going to be able to consistently handle his drops? He has the athleticism to do it. There were a lot of pass breakups, but there were also a lot of times where it looked like he wasn't necessarily sure of his assignments when he was asked to drop back in coverage. And he only had 1 year as a full-time off-ball linebacker. So I think that weak side spot's the best fit for him right now to be able to play quickly. But they added two veterans that are going to start, so they're not in a position where they have to have Tyrice Knight start right away. They can have him develop as a special teams guy. I think he's going to be really good on kick and punt return cover teams, and eventually he could be a starter. I will say this. If Mike Macdonald pegged him as a fourth-round pick and thinks he can make it work, I trust Mike Macdonald's eyes with linebackers. The guy has an incredible track record. So if he thinks Tyrice Knight is that guy over, say, a Cedric Gray or some of the other guys that were available early in the fourth round, then I give him the benefit of the doubt on that. And he clearly can make tackles, led the nation in solo tackles last year.
And then really now that inside linebacker spot might be, one of, if not the thinnest spots on the roster, because they typically keep at least four on the initial 53-man roster. That fourth spot is Patrick O'Connell, Drake Thomas, Easton Gibbs. Is it John Radigan's job to lose, you think, for that fourth spot?
I think it's Radigan's to lose as long as he's willing to do what Mike Jackson just did. I fully expect the Seahawks are going to try to have a revised deal with him, too, to open up some more cap space. And as long as he's willing to do that, I think he's the four guy. Especially, we have to remember, with Nick Bellore not being on the roster anymore, and after losing Cody Barton a couple years ago, you've had an exodus of some of your veteran special teams core players. John Radigan now is the veteran special teams core player. So I can't see Seattle just letting him go and letting him walk. So I think he's the favorite there, with O'Connell being the X factor to watch here. I like Drake Thomas. I just don't know how he's going to fit in this scheme. If Pete Carroll was still coaching, I'd feel more confident about Drake Thomas, especially coming off an injury. Right now, though, I feel like this is more leaning towards Patrick O'Connell with his ability to play multiple linebacker spots. He's been an edge rusher before in college, so he'd be the wild card to watch here.
And then I want to ask you about one more undrafted guy, because a lot of different scouting services had this guy as a draftable prospect, some as high as the 5th round. And another player I wasn't familiar with, but as soon as I turned on the highlights, it was pretty easy to see why he was in demand by the Seahawks. How did Nelson Caesar look at the edge spot?
Didn't get much of a view on him. I was watching a number of other players, and the edge position was not one that I was watching closely. But I can tell you from my time watching him at Houston, very solid football player. I had a 7th round grade on him, so I'm not surprised he didn't get drafted. My biggest concern with him is he won so much at the college level with power at 254 pounds. I want to see when we get the pads on, is he going to be able to do that with NFL tackles? Is he going to be able to show a more diverse pass rushing palette? Because he did not do that at Houston. He's got enough athleticism. He tested fairly well. 254 is average size for a 3-4 outside linebacker. So I'm not necessarily concerned about that, but just the fact that the strength of his game was winning with power, I don't know if that's going to translate to the next level. And I think that was the biggest concern for teams. And I also saw inconsistent play setting the edge. So he is going to have to show that he can at least be better than, say, Darrell Taylor in that regard. Are you going to be able to set a firm edge most of the time? Are you not going to guess and miss out on your chance to maintain your gap? Those are things that you're going to be watching for with him. But he is one of the players I have circled that may have a very good chance of making this football team. We just have to see how his pass rushing game translates. And that is going to be a player that you're going to have to pay more attention when we get to August.
We're kind of in that dead period, if there ever is one in the NFL calendar. You know, the OTAs continue. We see the pictures coming out of VMAC of guys running drills, but mandatory minicamp isn't for another month, June 11th through the 13th. Is there any position group where you think there might be a possibility between now and then of the Seahawks still adding another veteran or two?
The only spot that I would maybe see the Seahawks adding a player actually is running back. I could see them bringing in somebody else to compete at that position, though I think they like the 3 undrafted guys that they added to go with the 3 returning veterans. I could see them bringing in another running back potentially. I think they're set at the offensive line. I don't expect any other moves there with all the moves they made in free agency in the draft with the guard positions in particular. They're loaded on the defensive line. Maybe they would add another edge rusher. That might be another position to keep a close eye on, especially after releasing Levi Bell a week and a half ago. But those are really the only spots I can see. I don't expect any significant moves. And for fans that are hoping for some trades, the only time there's going to be a trade, I think, at this point is when we get to the end of training camp, end of the preseason. We've seen John Schneider make some moves then when he's trying to flip with other teams. And, well, I need this position. You need that spot. And he hasn't done it for a few years, but it's something he's done consistently. I don't expect any significant moves leading up to that point, including the Jamal Adams reunion. The last that I heard, the likelihood of that happening is not very high.
And then what are you most looking forward to seeing when the whole squad comes together for the first time in on-field workouts on the 11th?
The guards. It's all about the guards. I want to see how the pecking order gets formed there. Is Anthony Bradford clearly the guy starting off at right guard? Or are the Seahawks going to say, hey, no, you started 10 games last year, but we love this Haynes kid. This is wide open right now. Because last year, Evan Brown came in, and it just never really felt like Oluwatimi was really in that competition. I want to see how Scott Huff handles that in particular. And are they going to have Bradford, a guy that was drafted by a different coaching staff? Is he going to be the guy there starting off right guard, or is it going to be thinking, hey, we're alternating practices. We're going to see both of you guys getting with the ones. I'm really fascinated just to see those guard spots in general.
Anything in particular that you're hoping to see or maybe have a gut feeling about with the schedule release now scheduled for 1 week from tonight? Do you think the Seahawks are going to get some primetime spots? And if you had a choice of who you'd like to see them open against, who would that be?
So as far as what I would like to see, a lot of reporters do not agree with me, but I hope that the Bears game is in London because I haven't been able to go to the last 2 games they played.
I want to go to Chicago.
Yeah. And I've been to Chicago so much. I grew up near Chicago. Nothing against Chicago. It's a fine city, but I'd like to go to London for that game. And you wouldn't lose a home game either because it's a road game. So that'd be perfect for both worlds. But as far as prime time, I'm not expecting any more than 3 just because the team missed the playoffs last year. And I don't know that there's necessarily a ton of buzz outside of Seattle right now for this team with a new coaching staff, even though they got a lot of good young talent. They've got a lot of returning veterans that are talented. So I think 3 is probably the cap. The game that I'm going to bookmark right now that I absolutely think has a great chance to be prime time, Seattle and Miami playing at Lumen Field. I've got that one tagged because I think the Dolphins are going to get a lot of prime time games. And who would not want to see Seattle's star-laden secondary going up against Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and now Odell Beckham Jr., that high-octane Dolphins offense. They don't play very often. I just feel like that is a game that has a very good chance to be a primetime one.
Corbin, I always appreciate your time, especially as busy as things have been for you the last couple of months. I know you're away right now. You're in a serene environment on a lake house. Are you going to take some time off for yourself coming up?
Well, time off for me is a loose term. It's usually, I'm going to have 5 hours. I'm going to go do some fun stuff, and then I'm going to go write a little bit because that's just the way I'm programmed. So I guess you could call it a mini vacation.
I mean, you got to see Judas Priest on Sunday night.
I did, yes. That made it very well a mini vacation, getting to see Rob Halford, the metal god himself. So
the Pete Carroll of metal singers, just still ticking, still
incredibly good.
Kicking butt. All right, always good to talk football with you, and you and I privately also talking about some metal. So that's Corbin Smith. You can follow him on Twitter, Corbin Smith NFL, and of course the Locked On Seahawks podcast and All Seahawks. Thanks again, Corbin.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it.
Made it through an entire episode without one of the cats jumping into the frame. I don't know if that's good or bad. Tell me what you think of that. Do you like it when Butch and Spooky and Claudia, sometimes Meow Meow, make appearances? And by the way, Meow Meow is the one that punched me in the face. If you haven't seen that, you can find it somewhere on my timeline. I should just park that on the channel. It's a pretty good time. Keeps me humble, right? Sometimes you just got to take a nice shot to the nose. Love the insight from Corbin. What are your thoughts on what you're hearing about the rookie class? I'm especially intrigued by the undrafted free agent class. You know, you see some rankings out there. This is how nerdy some of this stuff gets now, that obviously we get the draft grades. And for the most part, the Seahawks seem to be getting Bs and B pluses. But I've seen some lists also ranking the undrafted classes, and the Seahawks are showing up in the top 5, 6, 7 of some of those lists as well. Interesting with their new cap guy, some of the way they've structured those contracts differently than they have in the past might make them more competitive in getting some of those top guys. I can't wait to see how this class looks. We're a month away from mandatory full squad minicamp, but so much to do between now and then. So keep it right here, because I'll just keep cranking out content for you to watch even during the slowest month of the year in the NFL. Thank you for watching. I'm Dan, at Seahawks Forever on Twitter is how you can follow me there. And as always, forever and always, go Hawks.